All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out on I was going to say, I don't always do events in April on a 95-degree day, but when I do them with Zach Powers. Thanks for coming out. I always show hands who has not been to a Speaker Series event before. This is your first time. So some of you have been to Speaker Series events? Cool, so we had a little mix. Well, thank you for being here. Very briefly, I'm Sean Murphy, and I direct the Center for Story here at Shenandoah, which begs the question, I've never seen the Center for Story. It doesn't exist. It's a virtual, it's more of an idea, and the whole point of the center, maybe one day it'll be a building here, but we just want to have events and programming where we talk about story. And of course, when we say story, a lot of times people understandably think talking about books. But part of what I talk about day in and day out is that story is part of everything. So whether we're talking about the business world or political world, even the athletic world, everything is narrative and story. So we try to interrogate how story works in society. But it's always a little extra exciting. I'm a writer, so when we can really talk story with a storyteller, that's my sweet spot. So I'm very excited. We have Zach Powers here today, who I'll introduce, but Zach, hold up your book. This is hot off the presses. Zach's brand new book, The Migraine Diaries, just came out. So join me in welcoming Zach. Thank you. And we'll jump in. Before I introduce him and we kick it off, I always also say at the beginning, these are very informal events. Questions are not only welcome, they're expected. I may even call on some people if I have to. That's a veiled threat. But throughout the event, just raise your hand. You don't have to wait till the end. If something happens or you hear something, feel free to jump in. It's cooler if you guys ask questions than me, so I really encourage that. So, Zach is a native of Savannah, Georgia, currently lives and writes in Arlington, Virginia, and his brand new novel, The Migraine Diaries, is officially available everywhere you buy books. His other books are First Cosmic Velocity and the story collection Gravity Changes, which won the BOA Short Fiction Prize. He was an arts and culture columnist for Savannah Morning News and serves currently as the executive and artistic director at the Amazing Writers Center in Maryland and Poet Lore, America's oldest poetry journal. Zach, thanks for being here, especially during such a huge week.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, this is my first official event, so first book event. Thank you for coming out and joining.
This is great. So it's so hot off the presses. I had to read an e-copy, which is very 2026, and we that's how we roll. But since we can assume few, if anyone here has read this, maybe just without giving too much away, what is your book about?
Yeah, I mean, the quick pitch is the novel begins when the narrator experiences his first migraine at the funeral for his best friend. And after that, it is sort of a study of chronic illness and grief and how those can be comorbid, how they can be connected to each other. And then also about this friend group struggling in the wake of the death of one of their very good friends. So, and the narrator himself then has this double struggle of how do you cope with this struggling friend group when you're struggling with your own body as well. So that's it, sort of in a nutshell.
It's a book about grief, it's a book about friendship, but also I would say, right, it's a book about pain. And of course that can function on metaphoric levels, on obviously literal levels when we're talking about migraines. I'm dying to know, because this is at once the worst question you can ask a writer, but it's also inevitable. Like, it takes place in Savannah. I don't know your backstory with migraines, but it's written so vividly, it does beg the question, like, how much of this is drawing on personal experience? And if not, how did you write so convincingly about place and feeling?
So this is certainly the most I've drawn on personal experience. But I am a fiction writer at my core, so there are a lot of deliberate moves away from myself. For example, does anyone here have migraines? Does anyone know the migraine? A couple nods. Does anyone here have migraine aura? Okay, so migraine aura is a neurological thing that can happen before the migraine headache where you literally hallucinate things. And it's really interesting because anyone who has it hallucinates similar things. For example, zigzags or fortress walls. If you ever go back and read the book of Ezekiel in the Bible and you're reading about his visions of fortress walls, he was just having a migraine. I'm sorry, that's my opinion of Ezekiel. He was having a migraine. But that's all to say, I don't have aura. I have maybe experienced a couple very small aura symptoms, and mainly when I was taking a migraine drug. So that's just an example. Like, I do have migraine headaches. I had one on Sunday of this week. I figured let's start the week of the migraine book launch with a migraine. But I don't have aura. So that's the combined, like, yes, I do have this experience in the pain aspect where I probably read a little more authoritatively. The joy of aura, I won't say the joy, the convenience of aura is that it's really well documented in literature on migraine. There's a book I have called Migraine Art, which is 300 pieces of art inspired by migraine, much of it depicting aura. That's like a literal depiction. People are trying to paint or draw or create literally what they see. So it's a combination of personal experience and that. So it's drawing from, very specifically in circa 2006, I had a year where I was getting migraines 3 or 4 times a week and constantly felt like I was about to have one. So like a very debilitating year. I ended up having sinus surgery, which may or may not have worked for me. I did have relief after that. That's just to say that when you dive deeper into the treatments for migraine like that, a lot of them are not necessarily real. So I'm not endorsing sinus surgery, but it may have been helpful in my case. So that went on, and then also, not concurrently with that, as is with the book though, but in 4 or 5 years later, 2 of my best friends died in 2009. One after a long battle with brain cancer, one quite suddenly, literally falling off a cliff. So I sort of combined both those into I think a stroke in the book for the character who passes away. So a sudden brain condition sort of. So you'll see like these moments of real things, but I always like squish them together or pull in something from outside that's in my experience so that it isn't autofiction, even though there's maybe some moments that are autofictional.
Sure. So one of the things that's so fascinating when you read a book and then you have a chance to talk to the author is examining these very things, like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, in terms of experience versus ideas versus when you realize, like, well, migraines really can function as a metaphor, and examining pain as almost like a state of mind is, to me, seems very 20. Like I wrote in my notes, I think a book like this would be timely at any time because it's exploring grief, it's exploring physical ailments, but it feels very 2026. It feels very of the moment in terms of, I think, this weight and pressure and dread that many of us are feeling all day, every day. I'm curious how that evolved. I suspect you kind of had a clear vision of what you were going to write about, the precipitating event, the grief, and the migraines, but it's also kind of a running commentary on being alive right now.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things. First of all, timing of a book. This actually, I was revising this book in December 2020, which is, those remember, that was COVID. So I wrote this book probably like 2019 through 2020 and revised it really deeply. So there was certainly the precursors to current angst. Beforehand, I mentioned I moved to Washington, D.C. We drove the area, Fairfax, Virginia, now in Arlington. Drove up on January 1st, 2017. There were certain political things occurring a little bit later in January 2017. So I entered the nation's capital, or at least the area, right in this seismic shift in the way democracy was functioning, or perhaps not. So that is in there, I think, and that sort of dread. You mentioned precipitating incident for this, though, and it's a little bit different than the subject. I published a book in 2019. It did okay. Didn't do poorly, but didn't like remake my life. I didn't become a famous author and just get to write books and not have a day job or anything like that. And then at one point it had not reached a certain threshold, and publishers around that time used to just get a paperback a year after your hardcover came out. Around that time, publishers started changing their model, and that didn't happen. And my book had not quite reached the threshold of be a paperback. And that's kind of a bummer when you're like sort of expecting it and you get an email 8 months in, like, hey, by the way, we're not gonna do that. So it's like, I'd been working on a project that was not a sequel, but a spiritual sequel to the first novel. And then I was like, well, it was also about the bombing of Hiroshima, and I did a lot of research. It's a horrid thing to research, worth researching, not saying don't dive into terrible subjects, but I was a little bit psychologically harmed from that process. So I needed to step away from it for a bit. And then I also like, well, I don't need to write a book like the first ones and don't have enough readership to need to do that. So I was like, looked at what I was reading, I was like, I like weird short books. That's my favorite genre of book. So literally the moment began with, I want to write a weird short book. That's where it all started. I was just deciding what I wanted to write based on that experience.
Fascinating. So
The fact that there are elements of life, again, I think it's always worthwhile when you have the opportunity to talk to the writer, to ask how, and also I know that you're a veteran, very experienced, very well-known, respected writer. That must help, but navigating the comfort level of putting yourself out there and also what a readership will assume. I think there's always this interesting tension of, I'm going to write about something, even if I'm writing, and I say this from personal experience, sometimes the things you write about that are completely fiction, you do a reading or an event and people come up to you and like, I never knew, or friends will say, I never knew such and such happened, and you're like, it didn't, it's a book. Talk a little bit about your experience with that, but also, kind of not only your comfort level, but your thoughts on how one has to maybe be comfortable with, once it's in writing, whatever you're putting out there kind of goes into the world.
Yeah, that's scary as hell.
Good answer.
I think, it's funny because I'm doing an event in Savannah next week. I'm going back to my hometown. The book is set in Savannah and does draw on other elements of things I've done in life. There's several chapters at my favorite bar in Savannah, Pinky Masters. And anyway, it was interesting. One of my early readers was one of my very best friends, Catherine Killingsworth, who's another writer, just a brilliant person. And she recognized a lot of things that I didn't even consider to be about me. Like, this doesn't feel like me, but because you're familiar with those aspects, you're going to latch onto those aspects. So someone familiar with Savannah is going to latch onto the Savannah-centered things, I think, a lot. Someone at the Politics and Prose event on Sunday is maybe not going to know Gallery Espresso or Pinky Masters. There's some real places that pop up.
Yeah.
In terms of putting yourself out there, I mean, that's the joy of fiction is you can always say it's a novel. It's a novel.
Yeah.
There's like the character Kat is maybe not the most flattering portrait of a character in the book, and certainly inspired by a real person, but not that person entirely. So, in that case, I would very deliberately never want to write very specifically about someone.
Yeah.
And then too, even in positive ways, there's a scene where two of the character who dies and another one of the friends start secretly dating. And that was inspired by my friend Catherine, who I mentioned. She and her husband, they lived across the street from the minor league baseball stadium, and they were living together before they were a couple. There was a house with a bunch of roommates, and they realized the other roommates all hated baseball, so that's why they did their secret dates at the baseball stadium. And I was like, but I can't write that. Because one day one of them's gonna want to write that. But I did want secret dating. So I had to hey, here's a roller derby. So it's very much a nod to my friends, but without stealing their story in the same way. There's no roommates, they're just, it's not that story, but there's little moments like that where I want this moment, but I can't take theirs. So that I would have felt really bad if I stole something from someone too, and I think that's a concern.
So I love this answer because now we're getting into craft and we're getting into ethics and the morality and the choices that we make as storytellers. I think, especially in our kind of social media era, we can say, like, I'm just putting my truth out there, but there's a responsibility about what you say, how it lands in the world, and the potential damage you're doing to people who don't have the opportunity to speak for themselves. And I think for a fiction writer, it's always all jumbled up in there, right? Like this notion of what do I tell, what's mine? Frankly, having talked to a lot of different writers, the fact that you even go there is laudable, because I do think a lot of writers, and that's why certain artists are seen as assholes, because they don't give that a second thought. They're like, I'm telling my story, and if there's collateral damage, I'm an artist. And I think that there's a responsibility and a maturity that comes from really kind of envisioning, could this hurt someone? And what is it, how much do I weigh if it is going to hurt someone? That matters. Some people would say it doesn't matter.
I mean, there are valid arguments to be made in that direction. That's just not how my brain works. So I'm always going to care. And I also really just value as a writer constraints. Constraints are generative. Like, I think, like, to me, like, something that I can't do makes me have to write around it in creative ways. It forces me to be more creative. So that is, from a craft perspective, I sort of disagree with everything's fair game. This is my life, I can do whatever I want with it. Like, okay, that's true. I can't tell you that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
But, especially with novels, I mean, one of the most common comments in a writing workshop is, well, it really happened from the author who's maybe having something critiqued. Like, well, that doesn't mean it's interesting, or doesn't mean it's good writing, or doesn't mean it's... So I don't... Enjoy being a fiction writer. I don't have to worry about that. And then, like, in the back of my head, I never thought I'd have a memoir project. I do have one percolating there. And the biggest problem would be certain things I would have to address, even though it's not really about other people.
Yeah.
Like, they would have to appear in certain ways to even make that project worth writing. So that, in that case, I'm like, I don't know how that would work, and I don't know if I'm ever going to do it, because I don't know if that's my emotional makeup.
Yeah, yeah.
So having written a memoir and a novel, I can attest that, and it's a very weird, unexpected thing, but I already alluded to the fact that I've definitely experienced from a novel people coming up and saying, like, I never knew X, Y, and Z, and me having to say, actually, that's not what happened. Whereas with memoir, as far as I was concerned, there are scenes I was telling that I tried very hard to render truthfully and honestly and in a very vulnerable way. But because it was real, people that also lived through that took offense or said, that's not the way that happened at all. And who's right? I think both parties, because we all interpret memories differently. And I think that gets into, the craft of storytelling. Like, you do the best you can to tell the most honest or convincing story that you can, but you also have to have an understanding that once you let it out into the world, it can be interpreted a million different ways, some good, some not so good, and at a certain point, right, we have to let go and understand that other people are going to bring their context and experience to the reading of it.
I mean, my most fundamental philosophy of art is that meaning happens in the space between the work of art and the consumer of the art. It's a painting is the easiest one. Like, you look at a painting, but you're a person. Meaning isn't in the painting. Meaning isn't in you. It's somewhere in the space between you and the painting. So that is going back to the previous question about the risk of putting things out there. Is you cannot control meaning. You can attempt to push meaning in the direction you want to, but there's always going to be, and I think maybe the most generous thing to do is listen to valid feedback about what meaning was created that you didn't intend or didn't even think about. I mean, talking about working, like, I look back at my story collection and, like, I wish I could write a lot of that. I was younger, I was more of a doofus, I had not addressed myself broader concerns in the sphere of writing. I mean, I think there's things I like in that book, and I'm not ashamed of it, but those stories would not be the stories that I wrote today, or revised today. Maybe write them, but probably revised them in pretty significant ways.
And so those of us that are a little bit older, can remember an era where, at least in a more analog time, we made a conscious decision, am I going to write a poem or story or book or an essay about X, Y, and Z? And if you don't, or it doesn't get published, it doesn't exist. I think the responsibility, this is actually, I think for the younger generation, this is already kind of old, this isn't an original thought, but what I think is both interesting and very weighty is all of us, whether we realize it or not, if we're using social media or in the world in a digital way, we're always managing our brand and telling our story. So things that we're putting out in the world, whether it's an anger or revenge or etc., there's a million reasons to tell your stories, but those do then take on a life that you might look back a month or a year or 5 years and say, yeah, maybe I should have put it out there. I'm looking for a job now, and that time that I was hammered and made these comments or was really angry, that's all part of storytelling and the decisions we make about what we're willing to live with once we don't control it anymore.
I mean, and to me, I think I used the word generous earlier, and I think generosity to audience, to other people, to self is the key, because you don't want to be scared. Like, I think that's not the message from this, is to be scared to write about things. But maybe generosity here is just generous with the world, and that you have such a small bit of knowledge about it, you can never comprehend the whole thing. So you're always going to be encountering new thoughts and new perspectives, and you should be able to go back and revise your thinking. If you're going to be a writer and you want to revise your work, you also have to be revising your thinking. You should be able to come out, look back at the book that you wrote in, I mean, you said 5 years ago, that was very kind of you, but it was, those stories are, oldest stories in that book are 15 plus at this point. And look back and like, oh wow, I just had not encountered this better thinking yet in the world. And again, it's nothing egregious or gross. I'm fortunately not that person, but I also think that person probably doesn't ever treat the world generously and just keeps plugging along. Friends and, okay, that's my friends and cough.
Well, and that brings up an interesting thing, right? Like, so I would say the upside of that is what could be worse than looking at something that you wrote 20 years ago and thinking, that's the best I ever did it. Now with athletics, right, or there's certain things that age and our physical abilities, we are at peak eras at certain times. But with things that we're doing up here, especially writing, and I'm just speaking for myself, and I'm curious how everyone else feels, or how you feel, Zach. To me, and again, in the writing world, as another one, not famous, not rich and famous as a writer, but the one thing we can control and measure is our progress and how we feel about what we're learning. And there's a certain pride in looking at your latest work and saying, I'm seeing things differently, I'm writing better, I'm more mature. There is something beautiful even about looking at orphaned drafts or published works and saying, I do that better now. But there's something beautiful about that, because that is measuring maturity and progress.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting off rating just slightly in my perspective here, but I sort of want to be, like, the fundamental thing that I want to hold on to as I age is a willingness to change how I think and accept new things. And if that's the only thing I double down on in old age, that leaves me in a pretty good spot. If that's like the thing if that's what I'm curmudgeonly about, and the only thing that I must accept in my life, then I'm going to be actually accepting everything else that comes in. So I think that's one of the good things about being a storyteller, being a writer, and being honest with it. I mean, I think, and again, I'll keep using the word generous, is it conditions you to be that kind of person. If you're really being open and trying to, writing for me is always thinking on the page as well. It's the George Saunders quote that, this is going to be, well, I won't say quote, the George Saunders, very bad paraphrase by me, is that the writing is always smarter than I am.
Yeah.
Because I'm saying some things here that I've said before, and I'm saying them okay in our conversation right now. But if I turn one of these into an essay, it would be much, much more refined, and end up working much, much better. So I do think that is one of the benefits of writing, is that it's this constant refinement. And once you refine it on the page, it ends up being better refined in your brain. So when you do talk about it, you talk about it a little bit better than you would have if you had not written about it. So
very, very well put. And I think what's also interesting is even a story that is told as well as it can be told and does well, at the time it's published, we all see in college or as we go through life and read, there are certain books or movies that were very famous or very beloved, and depending on how we've evolved as a species, those things that were very influential or positive in their time are seen as embarrassing or totally dated. There's that fluidity of story and narrative that I think we have to become comfortable with, knowing that even things that were done with the best intentions and done well might be appalling 100 years later. And then, to me, as a former English major, right, like I am endlessly fascinated by that, because even something that works doesn't work forever.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking before the camera started rolling and before everyone was in here about New England roots. And I am descended from Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, which at the time was this landmark of abolitionist literature, is kind of a racist sack of shit by modern standards. So, I mean, that's maybe the biggest, one of the best-selling books of all time looked at in modern standards is horrid in the way it's treated subject. So, granted, that's 150 years of evolution. I mean, and then there's books like, I mean, I'm doing a reread of Moby Dick right now, which is my favorite books. Also, hella racist. So it's like, how do you process these things? And that would be an interesting study. Those books came out a year apart, by the way. We were talking Moby Dick with some people the other day, and why is one still stand on some literary level and the other one just basically no? So anyway, I'll be back for our panel discussion on the relative positions of Uncle Tom's Cabin and Moby Dick in modern canon in September. Okay, September. Okay.
Done and done, because I'm the other guy that actually has read and loved Moby Dick. So more on that. But speaking of time, it couldn't be better. You just teed it up for me. But there's a recurring leitmotif in your book. Again, one need not have read it to riff on. I love, because it's a very philosophical kind of refrain, and it allows you in the narrative to go a lot of different spaces. But this notion that time is bullshit. Talk a little bit about what that means to you. You're welcome to talk about what it means in the book, but I have a feeling that you've got some thoughts about this whole time thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start in the book, and I mean, chronic conditions, chronic illnesses, chronic pain is an unmaking experience, and one of the things that is unmade is time. You lose a sense of time. It becomes what's timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly, whatever it is from Doctor Who. I mean, that is very much the experience of chronic pain and illness. So I think there's the almost literal aspect of that time becomes unmoored from itself when you're experiencing that. So that is definitely the root of it, I think, in the book. That said, like my casual reading, my fun reading, I tend to read a lot of like popular physics books, so I'm definitely fascinated. I grew up reading science fiction. I just mentioned Doctor Who, already covered time travel in the science fiction sphere. So I'm very much interested in it. Like, quantum physics and time and things tend to seep into my writing in a lot of different ways. I have like a whole section of a poetry manuscript that is like, these are the ones that all have physics in them. So they all and actually I just started a project which is, I don't know what it is yet, because it's literally just begun. It's on a notebook in my pocket right now, but about metaphor, specifically metaphors in physics, and how they, anyway, I'm diving into the physics side of things, so that keeps me, that's the stuff I tend to think about and fall asleep thinking about and think about on walks and things like that. So that's where the time aspect comes in my broader life. And I think, and again, I sort of think I really love work. I think that falls into the weird books aspect, books that are willing to grab from physics or music theory or anything. Any topic I want to see pulled into a book about another topic ostensibly. So I definitely like books that are willing to grab broadly and have broad interests, not just hyper-focused interests.
I love that. And do we have any readers in the crowd? Just show of hands. Who loves to read like novels and books? Okay. So there's a famous writer, Milan Kundera, 20th century, wrote a book called The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It that just made me think about it. But he wrote in one of his nonfiction books, which I adore, he talked about why he became a novelist, and his reasoning, aside from, I mean, the guy was a genius, so that doesn't hurt. But he talks about, he was a poet, and he did care about, he didn't say physics, but I mean, he talks about the different things that fascinate him. And interestingly, now I don't think I'm forcing the analogy. He was really interested in time. But he talks about a novel could accommodate. And I think that's what's made the novel such a malleable, interesting form through centuries and different languages and cultures. The novel maybe is the one kind of durable form where you can go there, where other art forms, it's like, why are you bringing physics into this symphony? But a novel, it's up to the writer. And the only criteria is, did you do it effectively? So I don't know if there's a question there so much as riff on maybe like this beautiful lack of boundaries in a novel that allows you to, if you're smart, you can show that off. But I think it comes from a place of curiosity and wanting to say something.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things, like, one thing in writing about an illness narrative, there's a lot of literature on writing illness narratives. And one of the big things is that everyone's here familiar with the idea of a story arc, right? The nice little swoopy up, climax, falling action. That's inaccurate for a chronic illness narrative. That is accurate for the cancer narrative, which is a very popular form narrative. You get cancer, you get sick, you go through your struggles of getting this, you recover, enter remission, and then you resume a life following that. And that follows this arc pattern. And within illness narratives, there's a lot of literature about how publishers and audiences want that shape, even if the illness is chronic and doesn't have a climax of remission or recovery in the same way as the cancer narrative. The cancer narrative is just an example. It's not the only type of that happens. So I was writing from a chronic illness thing, and then there's also the aspect of a migraine. I subscribe, there's a couple hypotheses about what migraines are. We don't quite know for sure. There's definitely a neurological component. So there is brain changing. And space and time can only be appreciated by perception. And so if perception is changing during the experience of a migraine, then for the subjective perspective of a narrator writing from perspective, he's experiencing something that everyone else isn't. A different time, a different sense of space. And again, I just barely touched on aura. Migraine aura is fascinating. Like Alice in Wonderland, all the weird things that happen in Alice in Wonderland, like the shrinking and the growing, those are common migraine symptoms for people who feel like they're suddenly as tall as this room or shrunk down to a tiny size. Or their arm will seem much longer or much shorter, or fingers. It's, and again, consistent among, not everyone has every aura symptom, but there are consistent aura symptoms among different people who experience them. So, aura in particular, when you're reading about that, is really just the brain going haywire with space and time. And then finally, when it gets to pain, I mean, pain doesn't create memory in the way that, like, I'm going to remember loosely for a little while an image of a little archway out the window there. Pain isn't going to give you something similar. You remember that I was in pain, but you can't draw pain. You can, back to metaphors, you can draw a spike going to your head, but there's no image, there's no smell, there's no sound, there's nothing that you can summon in the same way. It doesn't make memory in that same way. So a period of pain is almost a period where sense and space and time are erased for the period that you're experiencing it. So pain itself is an erasing of time, sort of, too. So it's getting into the time aspect. And again, that's one of the reasons that this had potential as a weird novel, was because there were the elements that, writing about this, you can't resort to the usual basic tropes of fiction writing. You can't, concrete detail is inaccurate because the narrator isn't experiencing concrete detail. I'm going to include details, and they're going to be, but they're not necessarily trustworthy. It's sort of a form of unreliable narrator, but it's not inaccurate in the way, or deceptive in the way that some unreliable narrators are. But he's unable to have a real perception of the world around him. And then getting to grief is very similar. I mean, I assume most people have experienced some level of grief and think of how the time stretches or changes or is experienced differently at the heights of feeling grief over any sort of loss. And that's going to alter greatly the way you experience the time and space around you.
So it's so interesting, right, for you to talk about these things that are kind of indescribable or hard to put into words, but there is the form of a book and language and words and navigating that space. That itself is a whole craft discussion. But you also mentioned something I'd love you to talk a little bit about, which is what the industry or editors or even readers are looking for with the standard or traditional arc. How much of that convention do you feel constrained by, or the opposite, where you say, I'm not super worried about what an acquiring editor might think? Because I think that's an important topic in terms of us telling our literal and figurative, telling our stories or the stories we want to tell. How much do we worry about what the industry or the perceived audience cares about?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with an anecdote from the early days of this manuscript. Before this, years and years ago, this was a manuscript. I mentioned I wanted a weird short book, and one of my favorite publishers is FSG. It's a imprint of the Big Five publisher, a big New York City publisher, and they publish a lot of books that I really, really like, and they are more willing than a lot of the major publishers to let a book go through that is somehow a little bit weird. They just closed the NCD imprint, which is, they had an imprint of even weirder stuff, they just literally closed this week, so
That's devastating.
that's tragic.
Yeah.
But I met the person, I met a woman who was an editor, and then shortly after I met her, she became the executive or chief, or like the top editor at FSG. And I told her what the project was. It was like a little meet and greet with an agent. She said, yeah, I have migraines. I never want to read about that. Also, that title's terrible. So that was my very first experience with this book, was the editor at the press that was in my head of where I would most want to publish this book, absolutely shitting on it. So that's where that started. Back to the question more broadly. There's nothing wrong with trying to understand trends in the industry and writing according to those trends or influenced by those trends. And certainly if you're reading books and trying to write in conversation with those books that you really like, you're going to naturally gravitate towards maybe the conventions that these publishers who publish those books are already taking advantage of. There is a very real practical concern that something that's too weird will be quote unquote unpublishable. My book came out with an independent press as opposed to a Big Five press, partly because it got weirder than would have been practical for a big press. I don't completely agree with that. I also, my agent, this is gonna be overstated a little bit, my agent and I parted ways amicably over this book. Yeah, she didn't think she could read it. And to be fair, the novel she brought me on for was vastly different from this one. It was a pretty normal looking novel. A little touch of magic realism, but it looked like a novel. That was the novel I wrote, I'm gonna write a novel that looks like a novel, and I did. So great. And it published with a Putnam, which is an imprint of one of the Big Five publishers in New York, so I did that route.
Yep.
I still disagree, and I still think this book has this, it was never gonna sell 10,000 copies, but I see plenty of weird books out there that do get press and I'm not bitter. I love the press I worked with. I love indie presses. I love supporting indie presses. So that's not that. I've just been bitter still the FSG editor. That's the only place I'm bitter. The utter dismissiveness of the FSG editor does not sit well with me. The rest of the industry I'm used to. So
And her disdain was for the Migraine Diaries was the title. I think it's a brilliant title. So first of all, and I read the book. So let's pull apart a little bit, because and it's very endearing, you're very modest. First of all, card carrying, weird is good, but there's weird that is accessible or inventory, what's the word I'm looking for? An inviting weird, where you're inviting someone to share the weirdness, and a weird that's kind of an off-putting, we talked about earlier. I put my truth out there. It's like, you gotta try a little harder as a storyteller, but I say that to set up, like, I don't have any problem with you describing your book as weird, but having read it and enjoyed it, that wouldn't be the first adjective, certainly in a pejorative sense. Like, yeah, it's a weird book. I think it's extremely accessible. Again, we're talking about illness and grief and friendship. But that being said, like, right, we do live in an era where we want our work to be read, we want it to reach an audience, but maybe certain stories really aren't meant for certain outlets, like navigating that space between the biggest publisher. We could go on a whole side track but sometimes the big publishers wouldn't know what to do with your book, and so even though you win the initial battle of, I have a big publisher that's supporting this book, if they don't sell it the right way or do it the right way, that can be an unintended consequence. But I also am fascinated by what our industry has become, which is agents, understandably, because they're in it to make money, but not taking a project on because they're not sure they can sell it. Like that, just, there's so much, we live in this world, but it's so anti-art, right? Talk a little bit about your experience and your feelings about that.
Yeah, I mean, I hate it. Because, I mean, there's, everywhere in the writing world, there's this push towards creating work that fits into a certain mold. The workshop model reinforces it. I love the workshop model. I'm not an anti-writing workshop person. Some people are very anti, and I think that's, again, valid opinion,
Sure.
and worth highlighting the reasons they think that, and I agree with some of the reasons they think that, for sure.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't run a normal workshop when I run a workshop, so I'm not like just regurgitating the Iowa workshop model. The University of Iowa is where it came from. And then to agents and editors if an editor at a big publisher wants to take on a book, they have to make a business proposal and present it to other people in the organization. So even this artwork you're presenting to them, at some point becomes a business proposal. This is who I think will buy this book, this is how many copies I think we can sell, this is how we can market it. So it is, before it is published, any book that you see in a Barnes & Noble, for example, which isn't gonna really carry many indies, has been a business proposal at some point. And that is antithetical to art. That is not an art process. Can art emerge that way? Absolutely. There's books, I think, Patricia Lockwood blurred my book. Sells lots of copies of books, does things on an international scale, and I think works in the highest level of art. I mean, she's a weird genius that I think pushes that into that level. I'm going to just name friends I like who do weird art. Karen Russell, another person who has a very high success level, making what I consider to be the highest levels of art. On the other hand, there's an author like, I discovered Renee Gladman recently. She wrote a novel called My Lesbian Novel, and she's written a bunch of other books before that. That one caught on for some reason, and it's metafictional, postmodern kind of book where it's an interview of the author talking about the book that she's writing / trying to write, interspersed with very brief excerpts from the book. So she's like explaining to an interviewer what the book's about. Anyway, it's also like my favorite book on the craft of writing ever written. Anyway, it's this fascinating, weird book. And that's it. It probably couldn't have gotten picked up by a big publisher.
Right.
But her consistency doing what she was doing with the small press, she did a lot of books with this press called the Dorothy Project, which is a feminist press, and it's amazing books all around. She had a bunch of books with them, a few other places, but somehow consistency for her, at one point she wrote this novel, got it published, and it caught on in a way the other ones hadn't, and it reached a level of popular success that she hadn't really experienced before, because she was worried about making art, and she made art, and those books are amazing, all of them. I mean, it's amazing discovering your favorite writer. Yeah.
So key takeaway to me from that, thank you for articulating that so beautifully. The key takeaway for me is we've already talked about ethics, morality, trying to use craft to tell the best story, whatever your story is. But at the end of the day, and I think this is a life lesson that I'm trying to learn every day, do something that you believe in yourself, because that is the ultimate satisfaction, and we don't know how things are going to land. You gave a couple of, or a handful of great examples. There's millions of others, right, in movies, music, that something that wasn't intended to be popular, something that wasn't intended to move units, totally catches on. And that's, like, I think that's what keeps us coming back, this beautiful, we don't know. And it goes the other way too. Publishers are making big bets every day on books that they're like, this is gonna be the next big thing, and it falls flat, and people lose their jobs over that. So there is this weird, beautiful pressure at all times of how art is made, or I think this goes beyond art, but telling it's a bit corny, but I certainly believe, I'm a card-carrying member, like, at the end of the day, you have to tell something that's gonna interest you and satisfy you, and then let the chips fall.
And it's a brutal industry to try to get published. I mean, not to discourage anyone, it's hard to get published. The success rate, like a literary journal accepts, most literary journals that accept short stories and poems, their acceptance rate is less than 1%. My current agent, who's shopping a book around, read 10,000 queries last year and took on like 4 authors. So the numbers are daunting. So you got to be doing it because you like doing it. And that's not to say that you need to be a journal, like keeping a journal or keeping it personally. I do think it's important to want to create work that is shareable, but in the end, it's like the people who succeed are the ones who work at getting better at what they're doing and aren't satisfied with where they are, and just keep trying. It's persistence is the only. This week I had 2 poems picked up by Barrel House this week. And I went back and looked at my first Barrel House submission was 17 years ago. This is the first time I've been accepted by them. So 17 years of trying, rewarded this week. So, and again, I'm considered by most people a pretty successful author, and still in this like ridiculous submission. My agent has failed to sell a book I wrote for over a year now. So it just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. So. Do I have time for one quick anecdote too? Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
I don't know what time it is or what time I have to stop. So, in terms of art making, and I've written an essay about this that hasn't been published yet. So I'll paraphrase it here. So when I studied music as an undergrad, and I had to take a class on music business, which was really, really terrible in every way, except there was this one concept that the class introduced, which was back in the day when the record labels were trying to pick singles, what singles they were going to release off new albums, they would get test audiences. And they noticed something with the test audiences, is that songs that got rated 5 by some people, on the scale of 1 to 5, got rated 1 by the other half of people. So almost split dead down the middle. So the songs that some people really loved were the same songs that some people really hated. That's interesting enough. But the solution of the music industry was to select songs that got 3s across the board, because that means you wouldn't change the radio station. That no one changed the station. Everyone's like, I'll keep it on and bob my head along. So you got like generic music. That's why radio, that's the origin of pop music in a way. It's like we need songs that are, I love some pop music, I'm not like disparaging it, but you're going to get an average of 3 no matter what you do.
Yeah.
And I would much rather have an average of 3 because some people loved it and some people hated it, and everyone going, meh. Yeah. So the art making process for me is, I'm not trying to be like edgelord, edgy, pissing people off, that's what I mean, but like I want to make weird stuff, and like I want someone to read this novel and go like, why are the chapters so short? Why is he hallucinating a corgi every 6th chapter? Like I want someone to be a little miffed just because it's challenging what they expect, not because I'm being weird and edgy or anything. But so art for me is in the 5s and the 1s. Yeah. In the middle is nothing wrong with that, because occasionally I want something, particularly in TV. I love 3 on TV. I don't want prestige television. Give me 3s. Give me average episodic television. That's what I want. But
So I was gonna say, Zach, like, that anecdote, right, does invoke a 20th century paradigm. In the 21st century, we all can attest, we're being buffeted by content that 3 is like a good day. And so to me, that's where I find my motivation for all the things I do. As a writer, as a teacher, as an organizer, it's knowing that the lowest common denominator is what people are paid to push on us. That's our chance to either demand more from what we consume, or if we're creators, and I don't just mean like literary, but creators of any kind, picking your lane and knowing what you want to do. Do you want to aspire to a 3? There's nothing wrong with that. You probably can make a better living, but in terms of sustaining a career, going for those 5s and accepting the 1s, I think there's a lesson there.
And I just can't imagine if these writers who do reach the next level by sticking to their guns and writing stuff that some people are going to hate, but then achieve success in that level, like that trust in self to keep doing the thing, maybe in the face of adversity along the way, that's where lasting art comes from.
That's right.
And I mean, I was like, going back to visual art for a second, I mean, when Monet came along, today just seems like the most, can I call Monet generic? I mean, that's just the kind of art you're going to see on a wall in your dentist office. Quite likely a poster of a Monet. When he was loathed when he started. So the other side of this too is that people who push this art that gets loved by maybe the avant-garde and hated by everybody else, often, not always, often that ends up setting the new standard for a future. And so now, no one would flinch at an Impressionist painting because we know it, it's familiar, it's not shocking. Because he stuck with it, he kept doing it, he believed in it, he got other people who believed in it, and that became, the mode of painting. And even I think today is probably the most prominent, most just accepted form of painting is something that looks like a Monet.
We do have a little bit of time. I want to make sure there's got to be a couple of questions out there. Don't everyone raise your hand at once. Yes.
I'm also a novelist and I've published 5, and when you were touching on drawing from your friends to create characters, I found myself unintentionally doing that and never occurring to me that that's what I was doing with several people until they brought it to my attention. And other times I did it purposefully, pulling habits and whatnot and physicality. But have you ever been confronted and asked, did you draw that habit from me? And it was totally unintentional and you didn't realize you did it.
Yes, with my life partner. Stephanie was like, does that mean like, oh shit, you're right? I'm so sorry. Because honestly, the closer you are, the less you're like consciously aware of the thing. It's just like a thing you're dealing with, and so it pops out. So yeah, it happens from time to time. I unfortunately, I think I'm seldom just outright. I want to be generous even to a character who maybe I'm being critical of. So I don't think I'm ever like emptily. We'll do that. Emptily claiming a characteristic from someone and just throwing it out there and maybe mean-spirited. It's not mean-spirited, I don't think ever, which I think could be a risk. I think you could like, this thing's peeving me, I didn't realize it was peeving me because of that person, and now I just thrown it out there for them to see. So yeah, it happens. And it has happened where I didn't notice it until after like I think it was published.
Yeah.
So I've had friends that have asked me, is that me in your work? And they're delighted at, whereas I've had family members that have said, I support you unconditionally, I love this, I don't ever want to see myself in your writing. So we're always, navigating expectations. And again, I think it comes back to having, I don't want to say moral, because that's a whole complicated, but one has to have a compass as a creative that we're navigating.
I'm not going to shy away from moral. I don't think there's an answer to what is moral, but I think it is a moral concern. Yep. So I think you've got to check your own self-philosophy and see what values you have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the moral answer, I'd be like, I think this is okay morally in the way I've done this. Like, I had not done anything horrible, but it was probably a trait she didn't want in print. Like, and it wasn't, I don't remember what it was. It wasn't anything like mean or horrible or like revealing about her like personally, but it was like, oh yeah, I can see that, and just, I whiffed in that moment. And morally, for me at least, that means here's a new area in which I need to be aware that if I've drawn from the life I share with this person, that I don't want to do that thoughtlessly. Yeah.
And again, I think it gets outside of creative concerns where we live in an era increasingly where the ends justify the means. If you can go viral, if you can make some money, that's the goal. And what I would offer is that does happen, and people have to live even with the success. And so it's the whole be careful what you wish for, because even if you achieve what you think you want and you get paid, a year down, but I'm talking about, whatever, not just in writing books, but just our on YouTube, on whatever. If you go viral, you make your money without consideration for these things, it could be something that you end up regretting. So even success can be, dangerous. Any other questions? Yes?
I remember you bought Constraints. So like within your novel, you said they're like real life experiences. Do you think that those constraints take away from your story?
I think the opposite. I think constraints make my stories better. In fact, I add arbitrary constraints all the time. One that I used in this book is that every chapter, minus the flashback scenes, maybe even then, I can't remember now, every chapter had to have 3 potential migraine triggers, 3 things that might have triggered a character's migraine. So I gave myself a trait that I had to find a way to, and they couldn't repeat. So first of all, that was a nod to the fact that lots of people don't know what triggers their migraines. There are some very clear triggers, like a Glade scented candle can knock my head into a migraine in about 12 seconds. But there's also lots of things like, no idea why this happened today. Did I drink half an extra cup of coffee 3 days ago? Who knows? But so in the book, I gave myself the constraints, and having to include them leads me to language and passages and things I had to account for, and took me in directions I wouldn't have gone in if I hadn't set myself the constraint in the beginning. So to me, constraints are generative because they require me to address them. And to address them, I have to write something. So even if the constraint is a negative constraint, that was a positive, I have to include something. But even like, I can't write about this, so how do I write, how do I write around or not including something? How do I tell a story without including something? How do I didn't really do this consciously, but it could be like, oh, this is a real thing. How do I twist it so it's not quite the actual experience I had? Which I think I say not consciously, I think I do that a lot. I think it's just my instinct. I'm not a memoirist by choice, and also I think by ability. I just spent so much time trying to write an essay to help promote this book. It was so hard. Personal essay. I've done a couple, but it's like, I don't understand how y'all do it. That's not my genre. Like, when can I make up my hallucinated corgi? When can I make up a cartoon corgi that just appears? So yeah, so for me it's the opposite. For me it's like, don't look at it. The word constraint has the prefix con in it, which is a negative one, but for me it's generative. It's like, I'm going to discover something I wouldn't have discovered if that wasn't there. And again, I mentioned thinking on the page. I like thinking on the page. I like playing on the page. That's just another area. To go with the sports metaphor, that's a place on the field where there's a defender, and I have to figure out how to get the ball around the defender. And that's fun for me. It's hard, it's a challenge, but it's a good challenge for me.
Center for story, right? Like, we're talking about how we write good words on a page that can evoke things, but making sense of one's life on the page, thinking through things. These are all ways that we're telling stories, selling stories, telling the story of our own lives through the work that we do. Again, whatever field we go into, whatever business, it's all making sense of this in the way that we use the gifts and the materials we have to do them. That's something that you have made a growing career out of doing. So I salute that and thank you for sharing that with us. We are about out of time, so if anyone has a question though, I think we can find room. But if we have some folks that are maybe shy, Zach, and I'll put this in the write-up that I do, but if someone wants to reach out to you online and find you, how do people find you in your virtual online space?
It's zachpowers.com is my website. There's a contact form on there. I think it works. I don't get contacted often, so I just assume it works. But I'm also the director of the Writer Center, and my email address is on the Writer Center's website, so you can find me there. By the way, I have some copies of the Writer Center magazine I'm happy to give out. It just came off the presses, so please take that.
Amazing.
Has an interview with me in it, because I have the power to do that. Take advantage of your platforms. Yeah. I have some copies of my book, and I'll just sell them for like $10. If anyone wants a copy of the book, please come and see me afterwards.
So copies of the magazine, copies of the book, zachpowers.com. We've done all we can do here for this hour, but make sure you get your Beyond the Classroom credit. The things are around there. If anyone wants to stick around after, welcome it. Otherwise, thank you all for coming out, and please help me in thanking Zach Powers for sharing his knowledge with us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great spring and end of your semester.
Yes, and maybe it'll be cool soon. We'll have some real spring art.
Yeah, if we were going to have one of these in May, it would probably be 50 degrees, so you never know.